Mastering Your Anxiety with MINDBOX. My name is Anna Richardson. Now, the reason we're all here tonight is because in our own way, we're all experiencing a huge amount of stress and pressure, particularly over the last year. We've been in the middle of a global pandemic, and the resulting epidemic, as we know, is a mental health crisis. So tonight we're going to be teaching you how to manage your own mental health and how to try and manage that resulting anxiety from the last 12 months or so. Now, what we do know is that the mind needs certainty. But at the moment, we're still quite unsure about what is going on in the world. I mean, for example, we don't even know when we can travel again. We're still a little bit uncertain about when life will get completely back to normal. When can we go back to the offices? When can we see our families? When can we properly hug people? So we know the mind needs certainty, and uncertainty makes us feel very, very unstable. So now is the moment that we need effective tools to keep ourselves resilient and also positive. Tonight, using a combination of psychology and hypnotherapy, we know that you will leave this session feeling relaxed and a lot more positive than when you started. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you're thinking, hang on a minute, I've seen you around Media City, you're the bird that does that naked attraction thing, you're always wandering around looking at people's bits. What do you know about anxiety? What do you know about therapy? So let me just fill you in a little bit about my story. So, yes, I am a TV presenter, and presenters are meant to be confident and love doing very, very stressful live broadcasts in front of millions of people. But actually the truth, of course, can be very, very different. Myself and my family have had to face some significant mental health challenges over the years, very sadly including suicide. My grandmother took her own life. My mother's nervous breakdown, OCD, and also anxiety and depression. My own personal crisis came when I was filming a few years ago at the Cannes Film Festival, and I was robbed in my hotel room by two men in the middle of the night. That understandably resulted in extreme anxiety, I think probably, to be honest, PTSD. And that was on top of the anxiety I'd already inherited genetically from, and learned, in fact, from my family. So I had to take a little bit of time out of work to try and manage the panic attacks and the panic disorder that I was developing, whilst also trying to do a job. So I realised that I had to take a couple of months out of TV and try and get my head straight. The one thing that has really helped me over the years, and in fact I still have the same therapist, is regular therapy. And I became so interested in how we can all manage our minds and how we can harness our brains and our minds to affect positive change, that I decided to train as a cognitive hypnotherapist so that I could go on to help other people as well, particularly in our industry. So, what are the things that we are going to learn tonight? Three things. We're going to learn about stress. What is it? How we do it, because actually we all express stress in a very different way. And most importantly, how do we beat it? Now, excitingly, we're also going to be doing some live hypnosis in the second hour of this session. So if you're into that, I promise you it will leave you feeling fantastically relaxed and a lot less anxious. If you're into it, then please make sure that you're going to be somewhere calm and quiet, somewhere warm as well, maybe with a blanket, perhaps somewhere that you can lie down. And if you want to, you can also record it on your phone, but it's around 20 minutes long and you will find it very, very beneficial. We're also going to be doing a little bit of a Q&A at the end, towards the end of the 2 hours. So again, please do get any questions you've got for myself or my co-host Gareth. Just add it onto the comments section. If you're watching via Facebook or YouTube, just go online and add your questions and they will magically come to us and we will attempt to answer those. However, to guide us through the next hour or so, I am going to hand you over to master therapist and co-founder of MINDBOX, Gareth Ogden.
Oh, what an intro. Thanks very much. Now, I'd actually like to kick this off by asking our viewing audience a couple of questions. The first of those questions is have you ever, so here goes, have you ever been consumed with anger at something insignificant? Now, feel free to answer this out loud, if you like, in your own mind, or even using the comment section on the platform you've chosen to watch today on. Here's another one. Have you ever been so overwhelmed with a task that you actively avoided it to just go and do something else? Have you ever been so overwhelmed with a task that you avoided it to go and do something else? And the last one I've got for you is, have you ever wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, so just didn't say anything at all? Have you ever found yourself in a situation, perhaps in work, in a meeting, where afterwards you came away thinking, I wish I'd have said that. Why did I not say it? Now, statistically speaking, almost all of you have answered yes to all of those questions. And that's interesting. And I'm going to come to explain why that's interesting in a little while. But I think a good place for me to start right now is with a definition of what we mean by the word stress. So here goes. Stress is a biological reaction to a perceived physical or emotional threat. Now, this is not an all-encompassing definition, right? And I think most of you could tell that, but it's absolutely relevant in the context of this session. And there's a part of it which you can see is highlighted with italic text. There's a reason why this piece is highlighted. The word stress is often used alongside another word, which is actually our root in to stress. The word that I'm talking about is anxiety. Now, anxiety is essentially the fear of prospect. This is what we mean by a perceived physical or emotional threat, because it is very much perceived. An important thing to consider about anxiety is that we're never actually nervous or anxious about anything happening right now in this moment. We're only ever nervous or anxious about the prospect of something happening. Essentially, we're running these simulations all the time about how things could unfold, and we're taking a decision as to whether or not we like the look of that or we don't. And that is the root in to stress. So you'll hear me switch between the two terms, and I just want to clarify what I mean. Stress is the effect that anxiety has. Stress is what happens to us when we experience anxiety, and anxiety is a fear of prospect. But what are we actually afraid of? In my time working as a therapist for now 13, 14 years, working with a lot of different people, you can roughly break down the areas that seem to stimulate someone's anxiety. And those can be broken down primarily into two groups. So there are physical ones and there are emotional ones. We can subdivide these two groups into areas also. Physical anxieties, generally speaking, are made up of a fear of pain, physical pain, and in some cases, death. I think you could quite comfortably fit health anxiety into this, which would essentially be a fear of what could be wrong with us physically at any moment. And I think most of what sits in the physical space goes without much explanation. It seems to make sense to us that we would be concerned about these things. Emotional threats, though, are a little more complex. So these are made up of social fears and a fear of failure, in fact. So let me just dive into what I mean by social fears. At its absolute core, a social fear is a fear of judgment. And if you think about our evolutionary history, we've got to keep in mind that for most of human history, the world was a pretty harsh place. And we came to learn that our best chance of survival was in groups. So we're social creatures, and most of us know this. But what that means is our place within a social group becomes critically important to us. And we're still holding onto that code. It is very much deeply ingrained into us that we must be accepted and we must belong to some kind of group. So our fear of being judged by other people plays an important part in our overall levels of stress. As much as we often don't like to admit it, the opinions of other people about us play a significant role in our lives. This also includes our personal relationships, marital relationships. A fear of failure is often showing up in the work that we do. So sometimes this might be referred to as a performance fear or a performance anxiety. And this is often observed actually in the way that we work. And I guess the best example of it in terms of how it shows up is what I would call stagnation, career stagnation. And that is where someone can be consciously unhappy with a job that they do, and they can be consciously unhappy about it for years, like literally years, but never choose to do anything about it, would in fact rather stay in this position for an indefinite period of time. And this really just goes to show how powerful these aversive drivers are. So even though these are negative emotions by and large, and we recognize them, we can acknowledge that they exist, it seems as though at times they have a strong enough grip to keep us away from bettering ourselves. So it really is important not to underestimate the effect that these things can have, even, like I say, if we recognize our unhappiness with a situation that we find ourselves in. There are some others that I'd say straddle between the two of them. And one of those is financial concerns. And you could argue that this is perhaps a subset of social and anxieties associated with our physical health. But I've certainly come across situations where this seems to be a primary focus for an individual. And the other one is what I would refer to as an empathetic concern. And at its core, really, that is a concern that we might have for the well-being of another person. So it's almost projected onto other people. And I think anyone who's got children would recognize that there's a strange kind of like software upgrade that you get when your kids are born. Certainly for me, when my first son was born, I remember over a very short period of time, suddenly being overwhelmed with an emotion that I'd never really experienced before. And that was my fear for him, on behalf of him. And I never quite appreciated what that might be like. And I think it would be fair to say as well, not to invalidate anyone's experience who have pets, I can see just as easily how someone can project a concern for their well-being if you've got pets at home. So we can break the causal factors down into these groups and therefore subgroups. I do want to just make a side point though, which is more of an observation than anything else. In my experience of working with people, you can almost guarantee that someone is going to present in one of these areas, maybe two of the areas, and in some rare cases, three of these areas. And that often means for someone like me, there's a little bit more work to do. There's some work to declutter the desk, so to speak, before you can really get onto treatment. Having said that, it seems over the last 12 to 18 months, the conditions have been absolutely perfect for all of these things to be aggravated simultaneously. And I hear a lot of people talking about the current situation as being unprecedented. And the point I just want to make here as a general observation is that from a mental health point of view, it really, really is unprecedented. So keep that in mind when you think about the extent to which those around you might be impacted by the various byproducts of the pandemic. I think, given your understanding now of these groups, you can see quite easily how our position within a social group might be affected when we've been isolating for so long, or our lack thereof social interaction. Health anxieties, again, really go without saying. Our concern for our general health, our concern for people around us, but also when it comes to trying to juggle work and life under these circumstances, our fear of failure has moved forward somewhat, at least from what I've seen in many of my clients. So whereas beforehand, I would be taking some time early on to figure out what kind of group one might be in order to start working through to treatment. It seems, for me at least, that whenever I speak to someone for the first time, I'm seeing evidence of all of these things at once. So if we think about the way that stress is experienced, we've talked about anxiety being the vehicle through which someone would get to stress. What we've not yet really got into is how it shows up in our overall behavior and in our life, and the various roles that we play in our lives. And this brings me back to the opening of the session, really, where I asked you some questions about things you might have experienced. And the reason why I asked you those questions is because they actually offer a perfect example of the three primary ways that we demonstrate our stress to the outside world. And those, as you may have heard before, are fight, flight, or freeze. Now, I know that most of you have heard of these terms before, but few of us actually recognize how examples of these behavior show up when we are anxious and therefore doing stress. So let me give you those examples. I'll just remind you of the questions that I asked you before. Being consumed with anger is a perfect example of a fight response, essentially where the brain is going, I don't like this, and I don't like it enough to fight against the stimulus, whatever is triggering this off. A flight response would be avoiding something altogether. And that might be by removing yourself from a situation, or just delaying a sort of an inevitable outcome. And freezing is where you just didn't do anything, where you didn't say anything at all. From an evolutionary point of view, that's perhaps one of the most interesting of responses. It also happens to be one of the least common if you compare all three of them. But the evidence would suggest that freezing, not doing anything, is largely a consequence of the brain not feeling as though there are really any other plausible options. So doing nothing seems like the only thing now that you could do in order to get through it. So that's how these things show up. What I want to do is unpick this definition even further now, and attempt to walk you through how you get to a point of being stressed. And I want to really pose another question, which I think is going to sort of set this up quite well. It's what leads us to an idea that is ultimately stressful? What leads us to an idea that is ultimately stressful? I want to just leave this hanging on the screen for a second. I'm going to ask you to read it, or at least try to read it. So I expect that most of you, if not all of you, have been able to read this fairly comfortably, as the answer to that question can be found in your ability to read this sentence. So what leads us to the idea that ultimately stresses us out is that the mind hates chaos. Anna opened the session up before and talked about disorder being one of the really instrumental factors in the collective stress of a group. Disorder absolutely is a driving force here. specifically speaking, it's chaos. It's things that we can't really accurately predict. So what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to try and reduce down, and this is harder than it seems, about 70 years worth of behavioral psychology into the next 5 minutes in order to help us build a better picture of how we're getting to the point where we're stressed. And there's a reason why I would do this. And ultimately, it comes down to the first step to overcoming our problem is understanding how we're doing it. There are lots of different standardized approaches to managing stress in a moment. But in order to choose the most effective one, we have to know where to point it. And knowing where to point it is a question of what is the specific thing that is stressing you out. So here goes in my attempt to try and distill these ideas down. I'm going to ask you to imagine this is you, right? And this is you, and the dotted line around you is somewhat representing the environment that you're in. One of the ideas that has been around for some time is that what drives our behavior is the environment that we find ourselves in. So it's one that suggests we have different versions of ourselves depending on where we are and who we're with. And this makes sense when you think about our work version of ourselves, our family version of ourselves, our friend version of ourselves. I'd hope that the person you are at a party is somewhat different to the person you show up as when you're in work, right? So this makes sense when we think about it. But surely it's not the only thing that is driving our behavior in any given moment. One of the other ideas is that actually it has a lot to do with our past, so things that happened to us before. Now, again, this would make some sense when you think about the nature of experience. If you have had an experience in the past that was somewhat memorable or even traumatic, there are certain lessons we take from it, and you can strip that back to the most basic of elements. It's true to say that it doesn't take a child too many attempts to put their hand under the red tap to realize that they probably should stop doing that. And that's an experience which taught us a valuable lesson. So our past experiences surely play a part in how we behave in any given moment. And then there's another idea which would suggest that it's in fact our future. The future plays a part in how we show up in any given moment. Now, this doesn't actually make a huge amount of sense when you think about it, because it's not happened. So how could the future have an effect on the moment that we're in? And the truth is that actually it plays a pretty big role. In fact, most of you have probably realized as I talk through this, that the way you behave and the way your stress shows up in your behavior is a combination of all three of these things. So here's what's going on. In a moment, you recognize where you are. So you take stock of the mode that you're supposed to be in. Let's say you're in work and you come into contact with information. And that information might be some rumor. It doesn't have to be true. It could just be speculative at this point, that there might be some change ahead, some organizational change, maybe even a restructure. And what our brain does at that point is goes tracking back. It goes tracking back through our experiences of things that are similar to that. And here's an important detail for that backtrack. It often goes tracking back through the experiences that weren't as positive, because these seem to be the ones that taught us the most valuable lessons. So we go tracking back, looking at all of the times where we came up against some sort of organizational change, and we start telling ourselves, this didn't work out for me very well before. In fact, there was this particular example, and there was this one, and there was this one. And all of these things are not experiences that I want to relive. And we take that idea and then we throw it out to the future. And we run a simulation. of how this could unfold, sometimes in the worst possible way. In fact, the extremity of that vision can depend on what we sometimes refer to as our tendency for catastrophic thinking. There are some people who just consider that it might not be very good, and there are others who've got themselves into a habit of thinking of the worst possible outcome. So these visions of the future range on that spectrum from this might not be that good all the way through to my life is pretty much over, right? So if you can imagine, we're doing this almost instantly, bringing that information back to now and then feeling it. That's really what's going on. Who am I now? How has this worked out for me before? What does this look like in the future? How does that make me feel? And that is the sequence of thought. And much of it is completely unconscious. So we have no real awareness that we're doing it at all. Now, here's a really important detail of what I've just described there, which some of you might have picked up on and some others maybe not. Our idea of the future, which leads to a feeling of anxiety, is based on information that we just made up. We just made it up. And this also goes, by the way, for positive emotions. In fact, the feeling of excitement is biologically almost identical to what comes from anxiety. They're very, very similar, biologically speaking, although our experience is quite different. But the same thing happens, right? So if we've got a holiday coming up ahead of us, we go, how has this worked out for me before? And now the thing with holidays is, for the most part, our experiences have been positive. So they can be quite overwhelming in that frame of reference, which means when we throw it out to the future, generally speaking, what we've got is a pretty positive idea. And we bring that back to now, we like the look of it, and we go, excitement would be the right feeling to attach to that idea. And you know what's funny is this even spills out in our language. So you hear people say, this time next week, I'll be there. They say this time next week, and they're basically articulating their idea of the future. And then what people do, which is, I think, funny but annoying in equal measure, is when they come back from their holiday, they go, this time last week, we were there. So they still give it away. They're still describing their thought process. Now, again, I just want to reiterate a point here, because I would start now to encourage you to think about the types of things that might stress you out, or moments that you've noticed yourself feeling stressed over the past couple of days. And as you do that, perhaps begin to unpick and unravel what is the commentary that's sitting around that experience. What is actually going on in your mind? Because it is the key often to unlocking the very component that will help you to control it. And there's one more piece of detail that I do want to just help expand on a little here. And that is, specifically speaking, how our memories play a role in a moment of stress. Now, I've talked about how we go tracking back, and this is somewhat an expansion of that. And this is really what is going to help you figure out the best way forward. We use this approach, and this is very much a therapist tool, to help a client really map out within that reality tunnel that I just described, where their head is actually going. And here's how we do it. So we've already talked about this idea of a stimulus, right? So that's the thing that triggers the whole thing off. And the stimulus are associated with memories. Our memories drive an emotion. Our emotion kicks off a response, and that response is one of three types of responses. We have a fight, flight, or we have a freeze. And then at some point that response terminates, and what that means is we stop doing it. I've never become aware of an example of an individual where their experience of anxiety is indefinite. So we can have some confidence, in fact, as much as these moments might seem to last for a long time at times, there is always a termination point. This will cease at some point. What happens after the termination, though, is interesting. And that is what we call the unconscious evaluation. So this is where the brain goes, what I just did was the right thing because we're still alive. We're still here. And we managed to get through it fairly unscathed. So I want to give you an example of how this plays out. And I'm going to give you an example with something that is a very visible version of stress. And statistically speaking, there'll be a percentage of you who are watching this who will be able to associate with this very specific example. And that is an irrational fear. Some of us might refer to it as being a phobia. So if someone has an irrational fear or a phobia, this is what's going on. I'm going to use what would be considered as one of the most common, and that is a fear of spiders, right? So here's how it looks. This is a very visible example of how the stress response can completely overtake us. It starts usually with a contact, right? So contact with the spider is probably the trigger. The memories associated with this, and I use the word memories because this is often multiple memories, not always one, but there usually is a significant emotional event associated with a phobia. And that, in this case, may well be a brother throwing one at me when I was 5. Brothers seem to be at the root of many mental health issues that I come across. I've got to be honest. Brothers, big brothers especially, have been keeping therapists in work for many years. So this is what we call a significant emotional event, and it often coincides with other experiences. Now, of course, the emotion associated with this is a combination of shock, terror, perhaps even a lack of trust. If you think about the role of a brother in this situation, this is someone who we would normally look at for protection and guidance, and they've betrayed that in this moment of what was, in their mind, a little bit of fun. That response in this particular case is the flight one, and that would be to run away from the spider. Some people might opt for the shoe or the hoover, which, as you know now, would be an example of the fight response. Any of these can apply, and there's no right or wrong, at least in my mind. But it's again important to recognize that there's a response, and the response lasts for a period of time. At some point, it stops, and that's usually when the stimulus has been removed. In this case, that would be when the spider's gone away, and then there is finally an unconscious evaluation, which is where the brain goes, that was the right thing to do because I'm still alive, right? And that's its core function, really, is as a part of your brain, and the job of that part of your brain is to just keep you alive. And much of this is really being driven from that space. Now, there's a reason why I've gone into some of these details, and I know some of you might be sort of enjoying the deep dive here, and others perhaps questioning why these things specifically are relevant. One of the lessons here is around how we go forward in addressing some of our recurring anxieties. So when you think about it in the context of this cycle, one of the things you realize is they don't go away on their own. It's a stubborn fact, I'm afraid, that if left untreated, if left unattended, then what our brain essentially does is just reinforce these things as being bad. So I've used an example here of one that we can see, and I'll follow this thread because it's much easier. If this person is afraid of spiders and they've shown some significant emotion as a response to it, and they've managed to get away from it, and the brain has gone, that was the right thing to do because you're still alive, what happens is the cycle gets reinforced. So another part of the evaluation is next time you come into contact with the spider, you need to get away quicker. And in order to get away quicker, I'm going to dump more emotion in. I'll perhaps tune that fear up just a little bit. I'll make that experience slightly more terrifying because it's my job to make us better at surviving these situations. So essentially, the whole process is reinforced to the point where this can become truly life-affecting. And the other important thing to consider here when you think about the way that these exist in our lives is because they have been reinforced so many times over the course of our lives, the prospect of letting them go in itself is scary. In fact, many clients that I've had have said to me the very first time we meet, I'm really, really anxious right now in this moment, just for sitting in this chair. And I, of course, explore this. I'm interested in what that is. Is this me? Is it the environment? What could be driving it? And the answer in most cases is because they are preparing for the prospect of letting go of something that their mind has had in place, which has kept them safe for most of their lives. And I'd encourage you to think about some of your recurring anxieties like that, because there's something that there's a phrase actually we use as therapists in relation to certain types of issues. And we say that someone has made friends with their problem. And we see this a lot. We see where individuals have become so accustomed to the problem that they've got that the prospect of letting it go in itself is scary. And what's interesting about it is that relationship can go deep enough to attach to you at the identity level. What I mean by that is, if we've had a recurring anxiety for some time, we start to recognize it as being part of us. And we'll even say things like, I am. We'll say, I am just anxious. That is the person who I am. And there's a danger here when you attach it to your level of identity, because it presupposes that there's little to nothing you can do about it. In fact, if someone's attached a problem to their identity, and I'd encourage you to maybe just think about this for a second, how do you identify with your recurring anxieties? If you're saying that's you, I am an anxious person, then to seek to get rid of that anxiety would be to affect a part of you. It is in a way, it's an attack on a part of you. And one of the pieces that we have to take some time to really focus on in therapy is detaching it from the identity so that you can consider it as something that you're doing rather than something that you are. And I listen carefully to people's language when they talk about it, because that often is an indicator as to whether or not we need to do some work to really separate those things out. So just take a moment actually to think about the recurring anxieties that you might have, and consider whether or not you would see them as being part of you, or you would see these as being things that you do from time to time, because that's an important part of the process. Now, after all of that, some of you might be thinking, what the hell am I supposed to do with this information? Right? And that would be a reasonable question for you to be asking at this point is, what am I supposed to do with this? In fact, I've covered so much in such a short amount of time, I think it's probably worthy of a recap. We have talked about what it is. So we started with a definition. And I did that by separating out anxiety and stress. We then went on to talk about the different areas of our lives where this shows up and how we can start to group it. And we followed that tunnel down to how we do it and the way that it shows up in our behavior, and then the component parts in what leads us to acting in a certain way. So consider yourselves very much upskilled on the science of your own anxiety. But the big question is, what do we do with it? What do we do with this information? And you'll be glad to know there are some things we can do, and you are now already more equipped to do those things because you have a better understanding of the process. That said, I have been talking for a little bit of time now, and I think now would perhaps, before we get into some of those solutions, now would perhaps be a good time to take a short break. We'll go with 5 minutes, a little timer will appear on the screen. And when you get back, we'll talk more about this process you can go through and move into a more immediate technique that'll help you feel relaxed right now. See you in 5 minutes. So just before you took a break, we were talking about this framework that helps us to map out what is going on for us during an episode of stress. And I used phobia to help bring this to life. But I also would encourage you to start thinking about the kind of themes that run through your stresses, your anxieties, and have a think about what are the different elements of that. What I'd like to do is share with you a fairly straightforward journaling technique that really plays into this approach. And it plays into this approach by specifically going into one of these areas. And the idea behind this is, if you imagine your anxiety having building blocks, and those building blocks are made up of triggers, memories, emotions, and responses. The journaling technique is designed to start dismantling some of those building blocks. And I'll talk a little bit more about the effect of that in just a moment. So let me just walk you through this so that you can go ahead and do it. You could do this tonight if you wanted to start it right now. It starts, unsurprisingly, by identifying the trigger. What this means is taking some time at the end of the day to log 3 moments where you found yourself anxious. So I've used 3 here as an example. If there were just 2, that's fine. If there's just 1, if it seems to be just one recurring theme, then go with that. But I use 3 because usually when you experience different moments of anxiety within a day, there's an interesting pattern that emerges. So I suggest more than 1 in case there's a pattern. So I want to give you an example actually of someone who I was working with fairly recently, who was trying this exercise out and was able to give me a running commentary of what was going on. So this particular person was trying to work whilst in lockdown, whilst homeschooling also. And they noticed there were these 3 specific moments during the day where they noticed their anxiety increase, and their response to it was more so in fight than it was anywhere else. We seem to have a preference one way or the other. It's not always the case, but in this particular case, this person did anxiety through the fight response. So it often showed itself as anger, as frustration. And here's where the specific moments were. In the morning, when they first opened their inbox, they noticed it and they got irritated. They noticed it as well during the day, specifically when they were doing some of the homeschooling activities. And in that, they were noticing it when their 5-year-old, by the way, this is a 5-year-old who you're homeschooling, which is no easy task, I can speak from experience, when they weren't quite getting it right, especially, and these are the words of the client, especially when they had got it right within minutes of then getting it wrong. It seems as though there's a strange phenomena in learning for kids as young as that, where they can seem to just forget something within a few seconds, right? It's a perfectly normal thing, but this was just sending this person into a rage, right? You just got it. You just got this 5 seconds ago. How can you not do this now? That was the second moment. And the third was when they became suddenly aware of the time a little later in the day. So around 4 o'clock, noticing that the end of the working day was approaching. And those were the 3 moments. So that's the task. That's the first task, is capturing those 3 moments. I'm going to follow this through now with this particular example. The second thing that you would do is you would acknowledge the experience of it. So this, as you might have seen already, starts to move us through that cycle. So you ask yourself why. You ask yourself, why is this bothering me? Why would this make me feel the way that it does? Consider what it is about these moments that make you feel this way. And this is how we started to establish a pattern of anger. So it was usually anger as it shows up. And I also noticed there was a pattern associated with time being lost. So that appeared to be the running theme when they noticed there was a lot to do and there didn't seem to be enough time to do it. This was a time issue. And that time issue, when aggravated, brought about a sense of frustration and a sense of anger. So where do we go from here? Don't underestimate, first of all, how helpful it is to just take a moment to acknowledge why you might be feeling this way. And there's a specific reason why this is powerful, right? But that process, that part of the process is key. Where we go from here is we engage the thinker. There's a saying that we use in our work, and that is, you can think and you can feel, but it's incredibly difficult to do both at the same time. So in an experience of anxiety, experience of stress caused by anxiety, we're feeling it. We're buried in that emotional state that you saw in that cycle. And when we're feeling something, it's incredibly difficult to step out and think about it rationally. So as part of the exercise, we encourage you to engage your thinker. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do I do that? How do I do that in a moment? Now, remember, this is a reflective moment. So you're doing this at the end of the day. Makes it a little easier. But I ask people to just think about someone whose opinion about stuff they generally trust, someone who they might consider to be the voice of reason. Have that person in your mind. And if that person doesn't exist in your life, create them. Imagine that there is a person who is the voice of reason. The job here is to channel the voice of reason and write down one reason it shouldn't make you feel that way about each of these three moments. So the person who was experiencing a frustration and anger at times seeming to slip away during their day, then has to sit down and think, right, so if I think about this rationally, what are the reasons why that is not a rational way to approach this? And then what they did was write these down. And one of them was, well, everyone's in this situation. At the moment in work for this particular person, there were quite a few others who were having to homeschool, right? So I'm not the only person in this situation. That's a perfectly rational reason as to why it shouldn't make you feel that way. One of the other reasons was, of course, perhaps the most obvious one, is that their 5-year-old is still trying to figure this out. And they will go from time to time knowing things and not knowing things. And it's worth just reminding yourself just how difficult this whole process has been on them. So 2 things that they were able to do just by channeling a voice of reason. Now, hearing me say this might seem really obvious, and some of you might be thinking, yeah, but that's obvious. Surprisingly, it isn't actually that obvious, and it takes for a moment of reflection for you to really do that. I was reading some research recently about this particular approach, this idea of engaging the thinking part of your brain over a problem. And the participants that engaged in this approach, just up until this point, by the way, so doing nothing more than writing it down, thinking about it, and then coming up with ways that that's not a helpful way to do it. So engaging the thinker. And in this particular study group, 100% of them noticed a reduction in their anxiety within just 1 week. And this is published in some work. In fact, the piece of work is called a neurofeedback, or I'm pretty sure I've got that citation right. I'll maybe check that. But there's a framework now that surrounds it. So up until this point, all you've done is take some time to process it and then think of some rational reasons as to why that's not helpful. But there's a 4th part to this process that I often encourage people to do, and that is set an alarm Now, setting an alarm is really about becoming more aware of this sense creeping in again. Because we are quite habitual, and because that cycle reinforces itself, it's absolutely possible that for the first few times, it still seems to come up. And your role here then is to catch it when it does. And for this person, that was becoming alert to the sense of anger, and then practice being present. So I'm going to give you an example now of how you practice being present. We call this grounding. This is a technique which originated, I believe, in cognitive behavioral therapy, first of all. And it's where you notice one of these unhelpful thoughts, unhelpful patterns of thought emerge, which brings about the emotion, trigger, memory, emotion. And then you take a moment, stop, and notice two things that you can see. And then you notice three things that you can hear. And then you notice four things that you can feel. And the approach is designed to ground you to the moment that you're in. And all I'm really doing is getting you to connect with each of your senses. If you were tuned in enough to your senses, you could go beyond, and you could try and identify things that you can taste and maybe things that you can smell even. So you can have some fun with that, in fact, by just building on and opening yourself up to more and more information that's around you. And that approach to grounding is often more than enough to disrupt that pattern, the pattern that would take you through to evaluation. The objective here is to dismantle the building blocks that piece all of that together. So in relation to the way in which you experience the problem, you identify the trigger, which plays into the stimulus. You acknowledge your experience, which affects your memory. You engage your thinker, which disrupts the emotion, and then you set an alarm around the responses. And that is a journaling technique that I would recommend everyone does in relation to their moments of anxiety every day just before they go to bed. Now, something that we often talk about in therapy is this idea of reinserting a positive pattern of thought in the way of the old problem-shaped hole. So something that can happen, and this is not hugely uncommon, in fact, someone can work really hard to break one of these cycles down, but replace it then with another unhelpful pattern of thought. And this is, of course, unintentional, right? We're not doing this on purpose. But unless we make a decision to put something there instead, we'll take that path because it's an easier path to take. So a lot of the work that we do beyond this point with individuals is helping them to reinstate a positive way of thinking where the problem used to exist. And without a doubt, our most powerful and effective tool to do this is a language pattern, which comes from cognitive hypnotherapy. And this language pattern is designed specifically to help bypass some of your obstacles and present information to you that you'll more easily accept. And you'll more easily accept it because you're in a state of relaxation. So you'll have heard of the term hypnotherapy before. And there's an element of that word that can be a little scary because not many of us understand what the process of hypnosis is. But I can dispel those myths right now. The process of hypnosis is guided relaxation. And it is a sensation which feels like relaxation, although in actual fact, it's raising your alertness to certain key information. There is no risk of one not being able to awaken from a state of guided relaxation. In fact, that heightened state of alertness means that you can be finely tuned to some aspects that are around you. We're going to try one of these right now. We'd like to offer you a chance to take part in a guided relaxation hypnotherapy session. And we've loaded this session with language that's positive enough to insert itself where some of those problems would have previously existed. Now, even though this is a state of heightened awareness, what I should say is, because the sensation is one of relaxation, you shouldn't do this if your immediate attention is required elsewhere. So if you have food cooking on the hob, or if you're currently taking care of small children who are running around and they could put their fingers in plug holes and all of that, then this wouldn't be a good thing to do. Of course, if they're sleeping peacefully and they're safe and sound, then it's okay. There's, like I say, no risk that you're going to lose complete awareness. But it is important that we just stress that if you're in control of anything and your immediate attention is required elsewhere, this of course includes driving, by the way, then don't do this. But if you can, if you're willing, if you're able, get yourself into a comfortable position. And it's better if you can do this with headphones. It's not essential, but if you're listening with headphones, that's going to make it a little more immersive for you. If you can get into a lying position, that also helps quite a bit. And if you can get something that'll help you stay warm, sometimes your body temperature drops just slightly when you relax. So if you've got a blanket or something, that'll also help. Now, you'll also be glad to know that I won't be the person guiding you through this. There is someone who you've already heard from who has a much better voice for this than me, and a voice that I think you'd be happier to be guided into a state of relaxation with. So we're going to give you just a brief minute, if you haven't already, to get yourself set up, get yourself ready, comfortable in a position that you feel like you could relax in. And then when you are ready, I'm going to hand over to none other than Anna Richardson, who's going to guide you through the next 20 minutes of relaxation.
Lovely. Okay, guys, just while you are getting yourselves together, just get yourself into a position that you find comfortable. And as Gareth said, it could be sitting or lying down, whatever you prefer, but just make sure you're warm as well. And you're not going to be disturbed. I'm also going to just take myself off video as well, just so that you can completely focus and that nobody's going to be distracted. So bear with me. I'm going to stop video right now. Okay. And you can still hear my voice. And if you want to, then you can record this session on your phone as well. And just to let you know as well that I am in a place that's quite stormy. So if you can hear any of the wind in the background, just allow it to relax you even more. So whenever you're ready, I want you to roll your eyes up and just look at your eyebrows. So lying down or sitting, just roll your eyes up, just looking at your eyebrows, and you might feel your eyes straining a bit, but that's okay. Just breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. And on the third breath, just let your eyelids close right down. And as they close and relax, I want you to just allow a drifting, floating feeling to develop in your body. You don't need to try and make it happen. Just think of it happening. Imagine it and feel it like a wave of relaxation washing over your body in whatever way you would imagine it. Going from your head all the way down to your toes, so you can begin to find a level of relaxation deeper than before, so that this wave of comfortable quietness passing right through your body could just help you to let go even further, while you let your mind wander about what it might feel like to listen and relax. And what's interesting about the feeling of relaxation is that everyone tends to experience it in a slightly different way. So much so that you could say that every way is the right way. So let your breathing sink a little deeper into the chest. As you find yourself a comfortable position to imagine what it might feel like to notice your feeling of relaxation. And just imagine if that feeling had some sort of form or appearance. What would it look like? Maybe it could be a shape or even have a colour. Perhaps there's a sound associated with it. And if you could allow yourself to think about that, you could probably imagine that feeling move, or even enter your body at the very top of your head, gradually moving down through the forehead, allowing all of the muscles it comes into contact with to relax. The eyes and your face, allowing even the tiny muscles around your eyes to begin to let go. And each breath can let that feeling sink a little deeper, down through the neck, so that your head can rest in a position you find more comfortable than before. And it's okay if your mind starts to drift in and out of the words you hear, because it's okay for that feeling to drop further down, deeper, more relaxing, into the chest and down the arms, as you continue to drift a little deeper, sinking through your stomach. And it's good to notice just how much more relaxed you are than before. And when you're ready to go further, the feeling can also sink down into your legs, so you can begin to find a level of relaxation deeper than before. Perhaps even deeper than a time when you felt completely relaxed. So that this wave of comfortable quietness, passing right through your body, can reach the bottom of your feet. So just let yourself enjoy how relaxed you are right now. And as you continue to drift and relax even further than before, noticing your breathing sink deeper into the chest, you can wonder for a moment whether your unconscious mind has waited up until now to allow you to listen to this and start, then continue to change, and whether you'll begin to notice differences in yourself this week or the next in the way that you're aware of less and less the symptoms of anxiety you used to have, as your mind begins to continue to break down the connections your memories had with the feelings of anxiety you've had up until now. Because it's interesting to realize that the feelings you have noticed up until now are actually a sign that your mind is working exactly how it should do in order to keep you safe from what it thinks are physical and emotional threats. But what can be different from now or later is that your mind can recalibrate, relearn, re-understand with each time you listen at an unconscious level. Because during the time that you listen to my words, you will develop a new and greater self-awareness. A level of awareness that gives you a fresh and empowering sense of control. Which means that in this state, it's almost as if you can reach into your mind and change the way that it's working, altering the way it tells your body to respond in those situations. So that instead of anxiety, you might notice calm confidence, or perhaps even nothing at all. Which means it might not be until later, looking back, that you realize the problem you used to have just isn't there anymore. Or that you are calmer, more relaxed, now and later, because of the way your mind is changing as you listen to this. And let those words connect with you so that you can feel calmer and more relaxed. Now, I know this can mean different things to different people, so I'd like you to think about what it means to you. And think about what other words you can say to yourself which make you feel better. Say them in your mind now. And as you form this new habit of feeling calmer and more relaxed, you will begin to find those feelings are there when you look, listen, and feel most or all of the time. And this means that before long, you might be surprised to find how much more time passes between the moments when you notice your old problem, allowing for hours or even days to pass without ever realizing it even existed. Because the funny thing about time is that it only really exists in our mind. We all perceive it differently. in the same way that we remember to forget, or even forget to remember, what it was when you last experienced it. And you can be amazed at how this new realization of feeling more calm and relaxed for longer periods of time each day can positively impact other parts of your life. So that you can find yourself noticing opportunities that have a sudden appeal unlike before. Which means that you might even feel compelled to challenge yourself in ways that you wouldn't have in the past. So that your focus shifts to recognizing all of the aspects of a future event that are positive to you, which makes them interesting and exciting, because that's what will make the difference. That's when you can realize the true potential in you. So that over the days or weeks that pass, it almost becomes normal to imagine how well a situation can unfold, which has an amazing effect on your behavior, where you can find yourself looking, sounding, and even talking in ways that, for you, mean that you are moving further away from the old, anxious version of yourself towards the person you want to be instead. So just imagine that for a second. Imagine what it would feel like to have those qualities. To recognize those moments when you overcame your old problem, as slight as it might be. Maybe imagine who you would be if you were free from anxiety. Imagine who you are, free from anxiety. And only you know what being free feels like. What it is that you're looking for that means anxiety doesn't happen. For some, it's a noticeable feeling of calmness. But for others, it's simply the absence of a feeling. A neutral nothingness, which passes over without you even noticing. Whatever it might be, that is success to you. So I just want you to take a few moments to imagine what feeling free would feel like. Now, I'm not sure what it will be that you notice first about the way you're thinking and feeling differently. But I know that you want to overcome this. And your desire for change is strong enough to ignite a part of you that is focused on creating a better life for you. A life with fewer emotional restrictions. A life where every possibility presents an opportunity. A life where you just can't help but pursue what you truly want and what makes you happy. And this transformation can begin sooner than you might think. So it's up to you to take the time to realize and celebrate the moments when you make progress, however big or small the difference. Because anxiety is like a skill. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And for that to be true, it must work the other way round, which means the more times you overcome it, the easier it becomes to be free from it. With each and every day that passes, you're building an even stronger mechanism to combat this old problem, leaving the door open for you to invest your energy into a positive aspect of your life, which will help you grow and develop to be more of that person you want to be. So just think for a second about the endless possibilities of a calmer, more composed you. Realizing a control you have, which has been lying beneath the surface until now. It's yours to take. And you can tell yourself that in a way where others might notice as well. So it's exciting to look forward to when that moment comes. And you can realize just how far you've come. Looking forward now can be so much easier. To start to build an idea of a more positive future. You know now that our behavior is made up of information our brain takes from the current situation, our past experiences, and how we imagine something will unfold, which for you can be enough to get better with each day, are coming to expect different outcomes. And you may or may not even be aware at a conscious level, but that's okay, because your unconscious mind will let you know in whichever way it needs to, that you have become better at dealing with the situations with a new, fresh and empowering sense of control. The situations that used to be connected to the problem you once had. Now is your time. A time for your unconscious mind to drive you towards what you want and get behind your intention. So for the next few minutes, I'd like you to take yourself out to a time in the future that would have once been connected to the problem you used to have. And notice all the things about you that have changed. All the things that make the difference. The way you are now relaxing. The ways you're thinking differently. How you are feeling differently. All the differences that make the difference to you. And as you do, imagine going down and connecting with yourself and that event to notice whatever it is that lets you know you're better. You're better. Immersing yourself in every aspect of it so it feels as real as you can make it. Because it's a little known fact that the process through which our brain goes in order to imagine a future event is almost the same as the one that takes place to recall a past memory. This means that in many ways, our brain recognizes them both as being as real as each other. Our idea of the future is important because our lives are what our thoughts make it. So I'd like to ask your unconscious mind to remember those differences in the future you. See them. Feel them. Hear them. Take them and bring them all the way back to now. So that from today, you already have everything you need to be different in the future, now. And I just want you to picture yourself as that person in the future. Imagine what you look like. Imagine how you are behaving differently. What are those differences that tell you that you are now better, stronger, more resilient? Picture yourself for a few minutes now. And just tell yourself whatever words you need to tell yourself that let you know that you are stronger, more positive, resilient. Say them in your mind now. So all I have to do to give your unconscious mind the time it needs to take from my words whatever impacts you the most, whatever helps you, that enables you to move forward stronger than before. So that as it becomes normal, you can enjoy the certainty of just what it is that you can achieve in the time that it takes me to count from 5 to 1. Each number will also give you a little more awareness of the position of your body, the room that you're in. So that as I begin to count up, you can notice the feeling of your feet on 5, traveling up through the legs as I say 4, allowing your fingers to move as I say 3, and with 2, just noticing your breathing as your eyes can open, feeling calm, comfortable and relaxed on 1. And I know that we've got Gareth back, and you guys should all now be back in the room. I'm hoping that you feel relaxed and calm. You should be. I'm hoping that you've all benefited from that. I'm hoping that some of you have recorded it, and if you have, please use it over the next 2 weeks, every day if you can. And I will hand over to Gareth for your final summary. And indeed, I think we have some questions that have come in as well, Gaz, haven't we?
We do have some questions. It'd be great as well if we could hear a bit about your experience of that piece of relaxation. So let us know in the comments. We're picking them up on the various channels that you're putting them in on. So let us know if you have noticed anything different, something that you perhaps not noticed before. And if there were any words or phrases or indeed moments within that resonated with you, would be really curious to get a sense of that. Now, we've had a few questions come in, some really good questions, in fact. So I do want to run at a few of these. The first one is, how can we protect ourselves against comments? So I'm assuming from this, it has something to do with comments that you read on social media, comments that are written specifically about you. I'm not sure if these are general in your normal use of social media, or if perhaps this person has a public profile. In any case, I think my answer would be the same. So there's a really annoying impulse that we have that plays a role in social anxiety, and there's a reason why this impulse exists as well, and it's one that makes us think that everything is about us. So let me explain what I mean by that by talking about where it comes from. In infants, it makes sense that we have an innate interest in how our actions affect those around us. So infants need to learn really quickly that if they do something, someone else does something as well. And that might be feed me, change me, give me some comfort, let me sleep. And that is the hard wiring in its most basic form. So young children, infants, have this program running all of the time, which is to say, how can I affect what these grown-ups are doing around me in order that they're going to keep me alive? And what that means is they start to interpret even what the grown-ups do as something that they have instigated, and that might even include things that they haven't instigated. So they develop a muscle, and that muscle is whatever someone else does, it must have had something to do with what I did in the first place, and I'll have to calibrate over time to make sure that I'm getting the right thing, right? So when it comes to being a parent, that's a useful thing to know. But here's the issue. It stays with us. This idea stays with us into adulthood in many cases. So the impulse is still there. And what that means is when we come into contact with, let's call it offensive or insulting behavior, we think, what have I done to deserve it? And it's often that element of it which drives a certain emotional response. So if I think about this in the context of road rage, I've actually had road rage clients. I've had people come to work with me because they get road rage so bad their partners can't sit in the car with them anymore. And when you really scratch beneath the surface on this, often what the very thing that's causing the anger is this idea that they didn't do anything to deserve it. So someone hurling abuse at them when actually it was the other person that had screwed up, had made the mistake. So how does this relate? Let me just bring this back around. I'd encourage whoever asked this question to think about whether they're instinctively making the comment about themselves, as in whether they're asking themselves what they did to deserve the comment. Because if you're asking yourself that question, you're always going to get a fairly negative answer. You will literally drive yourself mad considering what you did to deserve this comment, right? So here's a question, here's a filter that I'd like you to pass over the comments. If you insist on reading them, I could, of course, just suggest that you try not to read them. I mean, that would eradicate it, but I'm working on the assumption here that for whatever reason, you might need to read them. So here's the filter that I'd want you to pass over it. And it is the question, what does this say about you before it says anything about me? And what you're doing there is you're disrupting this instinct to make it about you in the first place. So if you see something written which has an abusive tone about it, and you're asking yourself, what does this say about you before it says something about me? What you might arrive at is some way to explain how their day was going so wrong that they're projecting some of their issues on you through a social media comment. And again, there's some rationality in that, which I know some of you might be thinking, well, that seems like the sensible thing to do. I can't stress enough just how valuable that process is to engage the thinking part of your brain when you would otherwise instinctively feel. So Anna, I think you wanted to add something in there.
Yes, lady in the cream jumper. I'm just looking at the questions that are coming in, and the question is, how can we protect ourselves from being affected by people's comments? You've definitely have identified that this could be to do with social media, but also because we're working in the TV industry, and I think a lot of people here who are attending will be in television, not everybody. But I wonder whether it's also about, what are those comments? What if they're coming from our manager? So what if it's our immediate boss that's saying, you didn't do this or you've not done that? How do we protect ourselves against the hurt of that criticism? Now, one thing I would say is actually sometimes you've got to also, I think, Gaz, own it. In questioning what have I done here, sometimes it's in owning it, whether you have been at fault. But I think the key thing is trying to identify whether if you didn't really deserve it, then you can go on to say, how is this person projecting onto me? Is that fair enough? Because I think sometimes in the office, it's a different dynamic, isn't it, than just reading strangers' comments on social media. What would you say?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think you added in a fairly valid point there about accountability in general. So it's not a safe suggestion to anyone to say that they should just ignore comments in general. Certainly if we were to just place this into the work-related context and consider it to be constructive feedback, for example, that could be career-saving feedback that someone is giving you, and we don't know that yet. So there's a few nuances in there, I think, that you pointed out. It does just remind me, though, of one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite people, in fact, and that is Bruce Lee, who was best known as being a superstar movie martial artist, but was also a very, very wise philosopher. And one of the things he said was, take what is useful, throw away what is not, and make of it what is uniquely your own. And I really do stand by that, which is feedback is in many ways a gift, and we can treat it like that. But it ultimately is up to us to decide what information is going to serve us, what is going to be useful to us in our pursuit towards being better. And that is it's a useful way to think about feedback in general.
Thank you for clarifying that, Gaz. We've got another question in, which I think is really interesting as well. How do you deal with overwhelming anger?
Yeah.
We talked about at the very beginning of the session, how do you deal with that overwhelming stress and anger, especially at work?
Yeah.
Now, that is really difficult because we all get triggered. But I think that it's very telling when you meet people who manage to control that anger and that response. How would you say we do that, Gaz?
Well, there's a strong word in this, and that's overwhelming. So I'm going to assume that this is something that the person who's asking suffers from chronically, like it's a feeling which can be quite all-consuming. The word overwhelming is a strong word here. So I know I used an example before which included anger, but the example that I gave certainly wasn't overwhelming anger. It was just a noticeable anger. If I were giving some advice to someone who had this in a way where it could really affect a situation where they might even act out in that anger, I'd be suggesting certainly a more momentary technique, something you could do in that moment, which would help to diffuse it. And again, all of the ways that I approach this with clients, it focuses in on one aspect of that cycle. So an experience of overwhelming anger sits very much in the response section, which is right at the bottom. And we're talking about a potential fight response. If it isn't, if it's not become one just yet, it sounds like those are the perfect ingredients for one. So here's what I would suggest. And there are some steps to this, is that you would imagine for a second, if your anger had a color. Sounds like an odd question, this, but most people can answer it for some reason. Right, so imagine your anger had a color. I'm going to do this on myself. For me, anger is red. For others, it might not be, but for me, it's red. And then I would say, imagine what the opposite of that feeling would be, and then give that a color as well. Now, I could assume that the opposite of anger is calm, but it might not be for this person. It might be control. Okay, so we'll go with that. For me, the opposite of anger is control. So I'm going to give control blue. So that all we've done so far is just decide what emotions we want to play with, and we've given them a color. And then we do a visualization exercise. And what we do is we imagine the color that would be red in this case as the anger starts to bubble. And that's, again, my words, right? So that's how I experience it. Anger starts to bubble, and I'll imagine the color red. And I take a big deep breath in. And as I breathe out, I imagine that red starting to change in shade and get closer and closer to the color of the opposite feeling, which in my case is blue. Now, in one breath, it might not go, but in several breaths, I'm certain it will. So I take a big deep breath in, and as I breathe out slowly, I imagine that red getting darker and darker and darker. As it gets closer, I take another big deep breath in, and I do this until what I can see instead is my control color, that color being blue. And I'm integrating two things there. One is a visual metaphor, and the other is, of course, a breathing technique. And combined, I found that is a highly effective way to deal with immediate overwhelming anger.
And again, I'm just going to add that's a brilliant technique, actually. Those two things, as you say, breathing, grounding, and that visual technique of changing the red to the blue is a brilliant couple of techniques for us to take away. But I'd add to that as well that, you know, often our behaviour is learned behaviour. And as Gareth was saying earlier on with that Smarty analogy, the stimulus, the memory, etc. response, is that our anger, think about what your trigger is at work. What is that trigger? What does it remind you of? Who does it remind you of when you do get angry? Who in your life was angry? Because often you've learnt it, I would say. Is that fair to say, Gaz?
That's fair to say. You're speaking like a therapist, Anna.
Almost like a therapist.
It's almost as if you've been in therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
so yeah,
it's always going to track back to when you were a child, and which usually of your caregivers had that same response. Because as children, as Gareth said, kids look to their caregivers to get their blueprint and how to respond. Think of that trigger, think of that person, and think, do you really want to be like that? And then you can put in that technique as well, Gaz. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. So what you're describing there is an approach that really goes looking for cause and would be a long-term strategy for helping to deal with that over time. So we've got the two pieces there. We've got an approach, which, you know, the journaling technique is a great format for that. If you were to use the journaling technique to try and really get under the skin of it and understand more about what's going on. And then, of course, until that starts to destabilize the building blocks, you have that momentary technique, which you can use if it just rears its head at a time when you least expect it. Yeah.
I've got quite an interesting one here. So Fiona from Fallowfield, I used to live in Fallowfield, Fiona, good place. Fiona from Fallowfield says, this is really interesting. What happens if you try and be everything to everyone and then you keep all your stress in? And I presume, Fiona, you're saying you don't tell people what you really mean. So what is that about, Gaz?
Yes, so I'm afraid to say the outcome of this is not a positive one. Some people seem to be better than others at suppressing the behavioral response, as in the bit that shows itself outward. Some people are better at hiding that than others. But that doesn't mean to say it's still not going on, right? It's still going on. Whether you're showing that in your external behavior or not, that cycle is still fulfilling itself. Which means, if you remember when I talked before about the nature of reinforced cycles, that whenever we do it, irrespective of whether it shows, we are getting better at it, as in we're getting better at the problem. So often people talk about old people as if they're set in their ways. Have you ever heard someone say that? Oh, they're set in their ways. You know, my older relative set in their ways. The reality is that they're just better at their bad habits because they've had more time to reinforce them, right? And anxiety is the same. The more we do it, the better we get at it. So that's one aspect to this, that if it's left unattended, then it will reinforce itself. Now, the other aspect to this is, so the question I think was what happens? There's also an analogy that I often give, which is we all carry around this bucket, like some container, and in that container is water. If you imagine that water represents your threshold for stress, right? It's the amount that you can carry around, because something we haven't said, what we've not talked about in this event, is how certain stresses are actually a positive resource. You know, not all stress is bad. It's a whole other topic, but let's just acknowledge that for a moment, that many of us are carrying around a certain amount of stress with us at any moment. But there is a limit to the amount that we can carry around. And it seems to me the people who are good at internalizing it have a slightly bigger container, so they can carry more around, but they're not immune to it spilling over the edge. So it's in my experience that you can only internalize for a certain amount of time, and eventually it will spill over the edge. And what's interesting is, if you think about it in the context of the bucket of water, the thing that spills it over the edge could be, on the surface, irrelevant. It could be something which seems so benign that most people would completely overlook. In fact, I worked with someone once who was an executive, right? So she was very senior in a company, highly cerebral, could think about lots of different things, very, very smart. And she had a breakdown. And when she talked through the moment where it all just sort of started to unravel, it was because her hair straighteners wouldn't work, right? Now, of course, and she was really giving herself a hard time about this, because she's going, you know, I don't even care about my hair straighteners. And I was saying, yeah, and neither do I. It's not about the hair straighteners, right? That just happened to be the teaspoon of water that made everything spill over the edge. So really, this is just a note of caution to the person who asked that question.
To Fiona, yeah.
Yeah, to Fiona. What happens if you take everything on and you internalize and you keep it down? Eventually, it will start to show itself. Now, that doesn't mean to say it has to show itself in order for you to manage it. But what it does mean is you've got to pay more careful attention to the times where you experience it, because it's not showing itself. It might not be affecting your life, so it might not be getting in the way of anything as much. And importantly, others around you might not be saying, "Hey, I've noticed you're not yourself recently," and that's a good trigger point for a lot of people when someone calls them out on it. So if you're not getting called out on it, you could very easily neglect the self-care process. and sooner or later it'll bite you in the bum. It is in my experience that if left unattended, it's not going to go away on its own. Yeah.
Exactly. And just to jump in there as well, Fiona, I would say, I think what's interesting is you're saying that you're trying to be everything to everyone. I wonder if this goes back to the beginning of our session, Gaz, when we talk about social anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, Fiona, whether you're talking about the need to be liked and the need to be accepted and approved of. Because if you're not, then that's rejection, which is very, very triggering for people. There's tremendous freedom in learning to say no. You know, with love in your heart and with kindness, just to say no and put your therapists will often talk about boundaries and that we need to put boundaries in place, whether that's in our home life or at work. So they are our personal limits where you just say to people, this is my boundary. I can't do this. I'm sorry. And it goes back to the self-care, I think, that Gareth is talking about. Yeah. So if you do carry on being everything to everyone and that you are unable to express your stress, then as Gareth says, you will end up, that bucket of water analogy, you will end up with all of that water spilling over, and you will end up, you know, sort of having some kind of screaming fit or just getting very stressed. So yeah, learn to put your boundaries in place and to say no with love and kindness to people. I hope that helps. Now then, okay, this is an interesting one, Gaz. This is from Dinesh. I think it's Dinesh or Dinesh, but I presume it's Dinesh. Dinesh says, is it a myth that very confident people can struggle with anxiety?
Is it a myth? I'm going to have to try and unpick that because
it's
like there's a double negative in there.
I know. Dinesh, you've literally scrambled both our brains. Are you saying that very confident people can't have anxiety? I'm presuming that's what you're saying, that if you're really confident, then you therefore don't struggle with anxiety. I think that's what you're saying. Myth that so very confident people can struggle with anxiety. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, it looks as though it's saying if you're very confident, then therefore you don't struggle with anxiety. And of course, that's a myth.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I'm sure you could speak from your own experiences, but also having worked with other people who are in the TV industry, those who do live TV. In fact, I think we spoke one time, didn't we, about Holly Willoughby and her testimony to feeling anxious when she's about to do some live TV. And I remember her once saying, she was doing, I think, the X Factor or, it was one of those big live shows, you know, several million viewers. And she said she'd stand behind these doors and before they were about to open, she'd suddenly be overwhelmed with thoughts about not wanting to do it. And I remember saying one time she was turning to her side, you know, like various runners and going, I don't want to do this, you know, and they'd literally give it, they're counting her in. And to watch her on screen, you would just never know. You would think this person is the absolute picture of confidence.
Absolutely.
And what's often going on here is, well, there's a certain amount of competence within it, as in someone has finely tuned their ability to do a certain thing. And in her case, in your case, that is presenting, that is being able to stand and speak and make sense, you know, roughly speaking, make sense. And as well, there's an important, also another component here, and that is talent. You know, talent is a real thing, by the way. It's this idea that anyone can do anything if they put their mind to it is not backed up by a huge amount of research. The research actually demonstrates that everyone has key talents, that there are things that people are just innately really good at. And if you figure out what that is, and you dedicate your time, your energy, much of your life to honing that skill, you get what we call mastery or excellence. And when you watch people on TV, that is what the outcome is. It's people who have a talent and have honed that talent, and they've been able to apply it even in the roughest of conditions. But it does not immunize them against a lack of confidence, so, you know, a social anxiety, which is really that is the component which is pushing hard back. You know, when you think about it, public speaking is a strange thing because you're really exposing yourself to a lot of judgment at the same time, aren't you? It's more intense than a social situation where you might be stood around 3 or 4 people, and 3 or 4 people could think you were strange or odd or not making sense, and you know that's daunting enough as it is. But if you're on the telly and you're addressing millions of people, the thought that you could be misjudged in that respect is incredibly daunting. So you know, I was going to say, so the short answer is, even though I've not answered that in a short way, is absolutely not. People who have mastered a skill in a particular field will still have an element of anxiety associated with it, and they've just become really good at doing the thing in spite of the emotional turmoil.
Exactly, and just to end as well, Dinesh, I'd say that, as you'll know, there's a big drive at the moment in television, and I hope across other industries as well, but certainly in our industry in TV, to be much kinder and much more considerate, and to create a less bullying culture, because certainly over the last sort of 20 or so years, there has been a little bit of a culture of, you know, this seeming very sort of confident, pushy kind of dynamic going on within TV, and we are pushing for a kinder culture because people are anxious, and all of us are fellow sufferers. So that's the very short answer. I am aware that we are about to hit 8 o'clock. So I can't believe that feels like it's gone quite quickly, but I will just leave it from me to say thank you very much indeed for tuning in this evening. I really hope that's been helpful to you. And if you do want to know more, if you do want any more resources, please go and check out mind-box.co.uk, which is our online therapy platform. But thank you very much indeed. I hope that was helpful, and we hope to see you soon. And Gareth, I'll hand back over to you.
Cheers, guys. No, thank you very much. And yeah, looking forward to hearing from you again soon. Cheers.